I want to say that this book struck me. I am the first mayor of color in Rockville, and just all of my own little struggles, way beyond thinking about the incredible stories of the women in this book and the way you wrote them. I felt like I was reading fiction, but it's not. You know, you had such an incredible way of building each character up, whether that's Cindy or many of the characters that I came to know, and telling their stories from how they aspired as little girls to growing up to be the women that help to change the world and to help save us and keep us safe. Not everyone wants to talk about the CIA, but thinking about the women who have really contributed to our safety so that we can sleep at night, right? And how often they did so with little credit, whether they were wives who were unpaid or they're women who had to choose between marriage and career. It was fascinating and sad. But with every story that's told in here and honoring the sacrifices they made for our country to keep going in spite of sometimes working in those little hole-in-the-wall office buildings that she'll be talking about in this book. We appreciate these women. We appreciate you telling their stories. And one of the quotes that really struck my heart is, "The women were trusted to get things done, but never awarded." Being here today is rewarding them and recognizing those folks who, in spite of, kept going, and we're so thankful that they did. I want to thank our author, Liza Mundy, award-winning journalist. She has been a New York Times bestseller. I know that this book is going to continue to do very, very well. I've been trolling you on Twitter or X. But she's written Code Girls, and she also works for The Atlantic, Politico, Smithsonian Magazine, among other publications. Please give a warm welcome to Liza Mundy.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. That is so meaningful. And thank you for your public service and for all that you do. It's really thrilling to see you on the podium. And I so appreciate your reading of the book, your close reading of the book, obviously, and your service as well as this wonderful crowd. I know that on a weekend afternoon in this kind of weather, you all could be at home in your homes with a book and a cup of tea or a glass of wine or whatever, and instead you're here. And that really makes authors feel very supported. And writing a nonfiction book that requires a lot of research, it is a long and often lonely road. And it does really mean probably more than you know to be able to meet readers and sense your commitment and your engagement with the material. And of course, a lot of what's in the book was happening in the Washington, D.C. area. So these kinds of audiences are always very daunting because many of you probably know more than I do. But I will do my best. And I know there's nothing more exciting on a weekend afternoon than a good PowerPoint presentation. But I hope you'll put up with this one. I hope that we'll enliven the talk because many of the photographs in the PowerPoint are some of them are in the book, but not all of them are because we didn't have room for all of them. But many of them are photographs that were shared with me by the people I interviewed for the book. Some of them from sort of classified settings in which we had to blur some of the faces so that the people wouldn't be identifiable. So I hope that it's a little bit of a treat to get to see some of these photos. But I like to start with this one because when we think of a spy, when we think of a secret agent, a field officer, we think, of course, of a certain character, a certain profile, and that profile is has been pretty similar throughout the decades. You know, he's a white man with brownish hair. He often has a weapon or a drink or both. He spends, of course, being a spy requires spending a lot of time in casinos, a lot of time having fights on the top of a train as it's about to go through a tunnel, and a lot of time on ski slopes, of course, pursuing or being pursued or both. And so that is our idea of what spycraft consists of, and specifically what it's the person we think of is generally male, who's out in the field doing the dangerous, important work of keeping the free world safe. And often when we think of women in spycraft, we think of Miss Moneypenny, right? We think of the woman at the desk who has a great sense of humor. She's very, very organized. She tells James what he needs to do in the field. She's the communications between James and headquarters. Of course, she has a crush on him. She sits in her early incarnations. I think she sits in his lap. She flirts with him. And so, she's not jealous of the women, of the Bond women, he encounters out in the field, but she's always there as a cheerful and extremely organized support system for James. And even in her more modern incarnation, this is the actor Naomi Harris in Skyfall, which I watched again recently. And although she is out there in the field, in the action, in the first part of the movie, by the end of the movie, she decides that field work is not for everybody, and she too is going to take her place behind the desk. And he's thought of her as Eve throughout the movie, and it's not until the end that we learn that her last name is Moneypenny, so that she is the latest incarnation of Miss Moneypenny. And I bring this up because this is a division of labor, as you might call it, that held true not only in the imagination of those of us who watch movies, but in the national security and intelligence community, that there's a place for men and a place for women, and never the twain shall meet, and everybody needs to stay in their prescribed channel. And that worked well for some people, but there were others, women in the book, who wanted to push against that kind of stereotypical thinking, and did so over the course of decades in a way. When I interviewed these women, they were just such such extraordinary individuals who wanted to use their gifts and talents in other ways. But given that this is what exists in our minds often as the division of labor in spycraft, I would invite you to imagine who in this actual photo of an actual debutante ball taking place in Brussels, Belgium in 1966, the embassy there, the ambassador there, or the Foreign Service was having a debutante ball for that all the embassies were to send a debutante to this ball representing their country. And of course, there were young men who were escorting them. So I would invite you to reflect on who in this crowd in 1966 was being avidly recruited by the Central Intelligence Agency for their clandestine service to do that dangerous, important spy work of collecting secret intelligence in the field around the world. So looking at the photo, you think it might be this guy. He really looks the part of a James Bond. I don't know if you can see him, but he's wearing a tux. He's got a beautiful young woman on his arm, which is also quite common for James Bond. Or it could be this guy sort of more off to the side, looking at the crowd, sizing people up. But in fact, it was this young woman who was being recruited in 1966 by the clandestine service. Liza Mundy was her name at the time. She's a central character in the book. This is her. She gave me this photo, which is just so wonderful. She was the perfect candidate for the clandestine service in 1966. She's the daughter of Melvin Manful, who was an American diplomat, a very active, very successful in the post-war era. She had grown up in Paris because her father, Melvin Manful, was sent to France to implement the Marshall Plan, to rebuild Europe's economy after World War II. So she spent her formative years in Paris. She was accustomed to representing the United States. She believed in American exceptionalism. She believed in the American mission. Her mother, when she was a girl, would say to her, if she, fell on her bicycle, she would say, don't cry. Americans are considered to be courageous. We're considered to be strong. You're representing America at all times in the public. So as a girl, she learned, to keep sort of a stiff upper lip. and her parents would bring her out at parties. She spoke fluent French. She was attending a convent school, so that she was actually more fluent in French than in English. And so she was used to diplomatic gatherings. So she was used to navigating the streets of Paris on her own as a sort of lonely child in post-war France, but she was also used to formal diplomatic gatherings. She actually attended Wilson High School in Washington. They came home to D.C. when she was a teenager, and then she went to Pembroke College, which is the women's college, graduated from Brown. Everybody got a degree from Brown University. By that point, she was fluent in French and Spanish and Mandarin Chinese, and she was also, again, very comfortable in foreign countries. Her father was also posted to Vietnam right before the Vietnam War, and she spent 2 summers in Saigon. So she was unusually comfortable in sort of far-flung locations, operating on her own, fluent in many languages, and she knew what the CIA was and what the CIA did. She was very avidly recruited by the State Department. She had worked as a translator for the State Department. They offered her a pretty high starting position, I think, GS 11 or something like that. So they were willing to start her at a high level because of her dad and because she had done so well. But she really wanted to work on the street in the clandestine service. She knew what the CIA was about. And the position that she was interested in was this sort of bland-sounding term called case officer. And the case officers at the Central Intelligence Agency really are the James Bonds of the agency. It's the fighter pilot position. You are living overseas. You have a cover identity. You have an alias. You have a cover job. And it is the mission of the case officer, and there aren't that many. It's a very elite cadre. It's your mission to break the laws of foreign countries by persuading foreign nationals to share secrets with you that they have access to, that their government is trying to keep from the United States, but they are secrets that the United States president very much wants to know about. So that's the job that Lisa was very, very interested in pursuing and was told would be available to her if she would only, eschew the State Department and come to work for the CIA. And the reason that a woman was being recruited for the CIA goes back to World War II. It goes back to the terrible surprise at Pearl Harbor when America was attacked unprepared by the Japanese. And that was, of course, the event that launched us into World War II. And it was also a terrible intelligence failure. At that time, and it's hard for us to cast our minds back to a time when we have 18 intelligence agencies in this area now. We have intelligence agencies that exist to oversee other intelligence agencies. Really. But back in 1941, we didn't have any of this. We didn't have a CIA. We didn't have an NSA. And we just, the American public, I think, became very, very painfully aware of this fact on December 7th, 1941, when we were so terribly surprised at Pearl Harbor. And we had to start scaling up our intelligence agencies, creating intelligence agencies very quickly. And so I wrote about some of this in my prior book, Code Girls, which is about more than 10,000 women who came to Washington during World War II to learn how to break enemy code systems. So basically to pioneer what would become our NSA, hacking into enemies' signals, producing signals intelligence. And at the time that I was researching that book, I knew that there was a parallel cohort of women who were being recruited into our fledgling spy service, our civilian spy service, which is something we had a little bit of spying going on, but always during wartime before World War II. And so we didn't have much at all in the way of capacity for civilian spy service. So World War II is this terrible and yet in its own way wonderful moment when women, for the first time in American history, are competed for. Not just Rosie the Riveter going into factories, but college-educated women who are being recruited either into the Signals Intelligence Agency or the Office of Strategic Services, which was our forerunner of the CIA. Women stepping forward to do the intelligence work because, of course, the men, after Pearl Harbor, were signing up for the fighting. And so all of a sudden in college campuses all the men are disappearing, literally disappearing, because they're going to recruiting stations, and suddenly the men are on, convoys crossing the Atlantic. They're on destroyers and aircraft carriers in the Pacific, they're mounting amphibious landings, trying to take back all of the territory that the Japanese captured so quickly. And so women are invited into this war effort, including the early espionage effort. One of my, I'm sorry, I can't see this as well. So one of my favorite documents I came across during the course of my research was this after action report, a 500-page report called "The Assessment of Men." When you're creating a spy service, you don't just have to choose people who can be resourceful in the field and operate undercover and work with the French resistance or the Norwegian resistance, or work effectively in a place like China where very few Americans had ever been. I mean, that's hard enough, but you need to find also people who have just a whole range of skills, right? You need to find people who can write propaganda, people who are graphic artists who can make posters, people who can work with carrier pigeons, people who can figure out how to sabotage a railway line. So it's this whole array of talents and skills, but also personality characteristics. Who can work in the field? Who can eat foreign cuisine? Who's flexible and adaptable? Who can deal with screw-ups, the inevitable screw-ups, work on your own, but also communicate with headquarters? Like, that is a really tough assignment during wartime to find these people. So a panel of psychologists was convened to try to figure out what are the characteristics that you're going to look for. So as men were recruited into or found their way to the OSS, Office of Strategic Services, they were given these imaginary scenarios at training schools in the Northern Virginia countryside on sort of former farms. Groups of men would be gathered together, and they would be given an imaginary commando kind of assignment. They would be gathered at the side of a stream and said, okay, imagine that you're in occupied Norway and this is a river and the bridge is blown out and you've got to transport a machine gun across the river and you're being pursued by the enemy. And so they would be observed to see who could figure out how to use some 2x4s to cross this imaginary rushing river, who could work with other men, who was trusted, who was liked, who would kind of shirk and give up. So they were being observed by how well they could work together. They were also observed in their off hours to see like who could maintain his cover identity. They all had to make up cover identities, try to sustain them, who could hold his liquor. And so it was very rapid training for who had the right, not just the right skills, but the right personality. And in some tests, actually, somebody would be assigned to kind of shirk and complain and thwart the exercise to see who could work well with frustration, the inevitable frustration that's going to happen on these assignments. So there were also women who were being recruited into the OSS. More than 20,000 women were recruited. No, I'm sorry. It was 20,000 in the OSS, and a third of them were women. They were very well educated. More than half of them had gone to college at a time when only 4% of American women had gone to college. They spoke foreign languages. Many of them were employed, making good salaries. And when the women were brought in, their test was they were not taken to a scenic location. They were taken to an office. They were given 10 memos. They were told to develop an effective cross-referenced filing system so that the memos could be filed and then retrieved effectively. And they too were observed to see who could design an efficient system and also to see who worked well with each other. But they were also being specifically tested to see who could cope with the frustration of having your abilities underutilized, to be being frustrated by being underestimated and underused. And that is a quality that the psychologists knew that the women were going to need, because they had observed that a lot of the women, no matter how accomplished, were started out as secretaries and clerks. So they were going to have to put up with that indignity, and they were being evaluated to see how well they would do. And as you can see, when you listen to my talk or read the book, that is a quality that the women would need for decades and decades and decades going forward into the Cold War and even into the counterterrorism period. And just quickly, we'll see, but there was a lot of paperwork during World War II. Everything was on paper. So this was a mapping service. Like, it's hard to also overestimate how little we knew about the geography of the world and, these islands and countries that we were going to be assaulting, or the amphibious landings, the airdrops for in occupied countries. We needed a great deal of maps. So you can see this was the OSS's mapping service. One of my, of course, all-time favorite members of the OSS, Julia McWilliams, was a graduate of Smith College in 1942. She wanted to join the WACS, the Women's Army Corps, but she was too tall. So she came from a well-born family, and Wild Bill Donovan, who ran the OSS, liked people from elite backgrounds. So she was from an elite background. So she started out as a clerk to Wild Bill Donovan. She eventually was put on a boat to China. War accelerated many of the careers of both the men and the women who worked for the OSS. So she was working in China. She was very good in foreign locations. They had to take some really scary airplane rides in very small airplanes, and her colleagues remembered her as a jolly companion and somebody who had sort of an iron stomach on these mountainous airplane rides. And she met a State Department mapmaker in China named Paul Child. And then after the war was over, after the Allies won, in part because the Allies were so inclusive, unlike the enemy, the women were mostly told, thanks very much for your service. It's time to return to your regularly scheduled lives. It's time to leave, open up spaces for the returning men. And so she did. She married Paul Child. She went with him to France as part of his State Department career. She had a great meal. She had her famous epiphany. She decided to learn how to cook French food. She brought it back to America and became known to the world as Julia Child. So among the many things that World War II gave us, our freedom, our democracy, our way of life, our food is a lot better than it would have been if we didn't have a spy service and if we hadn't recruited Julia Child. So that was the division of labor in World War II. These are a couple of the other women. Cora Dubois, open lesbian anthropologist who was headed up a research unit in the East Indies. That is Josephine Baker, the American entertainer who was in Paris and served in espionage in many different capacities, including smuggling out information for the French resistance in North Africa, written in invisible ink on her sheet music. And so she was very intrepid, like a number of female entertainers during the war. So then after the war, the women are told, again, thanks very much for your service. Maybe we're going to shut down these intelligence agencies. We won. Maybe we're not going to need this anymore. But then, of course, World War II gives way to the Cold War. And so we're going to need espionage and intelligence gathering and intelligence analysis more than ever as we mount this Cold War contest with the Soviet Union and with communism in general. So the Central Intelligence Agency is created. It operates out of a headquarters on E Street in downtown Washington that still exists. It's where the State Department has its history office. And the most famous early director of the Central Intelligence Agency, Allen Dulles, came out of the OSS. And many of the leaders of the CIA in the early years, for several decades after the war, William Colby, Allen Dulles, a number of the other men whose names you probably recognize, were a very powerful network of men who came out of the Office of Strategic Services. So the Central Intelligence Agency is created after the war. It's vitally important arm of our national security and our intelligence gathering around the world. And it's then, and also, reflecting the attitude during the war, that this division of labor becomes very sacred. The men are occupying these fighter pilot positions in the field, living undercover, gathering intelligence, working with people that called assets, who are foreign nationals who will pass secrets to the Central Intelligence Agency. Women are needed because there's still a lot of paperwork to be done, and all of this intelligence gets passed back to headquarters, and it has to be kept track of, and it has to be archived, and every shred of information on, Politburo leaders or Soviet scientists or people who've been meeting with other scientists in other countries, any relationships, any information have to be stored, and it's stored on 3x5 cards for years and years and decades and decades. So who's going to keep those 3x5 cards? Women, of course. And so the agency knows that they need women, but what quickly happens is that some of the women who served during the OSS realize that they're not being advanced in what is now a big government bureaucracy. And you want to do this exciting work, you want to serve the mission, but you also want a promotion. You want your salary to increase the way that it should. It's Washington, right? That matters. So women complain, like, hey, we served during the war and we're not getting these promotions. And so a series of reports, starting with one called the Petticoat Panel, that was literally what it's called. That was done in 1950s to say, like, why aren't the women being advanced? And what will happen, in the 1970s, this will give way to EEOC complaints. In the 1980s and 1990s, this will give way to class action lawsuits and sex discrimination lawsuits. So a lot of paperwork accumulates in which top officers at the CIA share these really stereotypical views of what women are good for and what they're not good for. So I'm just going to share with you some of the stereotypical thinking about women. So women can't run agents. Women can't work with assets in foreign countries. The people, of course, who have access to information in foreign countries are likely to be male. This is the thinking. Women can't work with them, and so we can't take them seriously. Just a couple of photos of the CIA officers who are sharing this information. The guy in the Speedo, David Whipple, that's him in Cambodia. So these are some of the people who are passing judgment on what women are and are not capable of doing. So that is one. That is. Let's see. So the one thing that women are good at is a sort of money penny, keeping a routine. Keeping the trains running on time and being the person at the desk who tells James in the field what he should be doing. So this guy, Hans Jensen, also came out of the OSS. He was an Olympic rower, but you'll note, in addition to the little dogs, you'll note the liquor cabinet behind him, which was also, thank you, that's great. I don't want to keep people from being able to see it. But the liquor cabinet was also an important part of spycraft, and it really actually was, because there's actually a lot of entertaining that goes on in spycraft, where James is mixing people drinks and inviting them into his home. Actually, a lot of recruitment of assets takes place in the home, not in casinos, not on ski slopes, but in a controlled private setting is really where a lot of the recruitment takes place. So again, these are actual quotes that showed up in these actual reports. Okay, and so women also can't work under the pressures of urgency. Women will panic in an emergency. So this is a photo of Heidi August, who you will meet in the pages of the book. She is helping evacuate the CIA office in Cambodia as the Khmer Rouge is closing in, and so she is under the pressures of urgency very much at that moment. She's in her 20s. She's a clerk in the CIA station. So she was a graduate of the University of Colorado at Boulder. She had written the agency letter when she was 11. Because she read about, in an article like the one that you saw from Time, she read about the CIA. She wanted to live in Paris. She grew up in Tucson. She thought it would be great to live live in Paris. Everybody who starts to work at the State Department, the CIA, thinks that they're going to end up in Paris. And so she was sent a pamphlet when she was 11 on how to become a clerk secretary. And when she was a senior in college, having majored in political science, that was the same pamphlet she was given when she went to the recruiting fair. So Heidi worked as a clerk in Libya. She witnessed the coup in which Muammar Gaddafi deposed the king and took over. She was actually the first American to see that. So she worked as a clerk in these incredibly dangerous settings for 10 years before she was allowed to try out to be a case officer, which she did become. And she's one of the central characters in the book. And you'll see her now in a photo. So again, this was a stereotypical thinking that women in other countries seldom have access to information of value. If a woman CIA case officer is going to recruit somebody, of course it'll be a woman. And what would she know? Well, what Heidi knew was that when she was a clerk for 10 years, she had access to everything in the CIA office. She locked up the safe at night. She burned all the material in the burn bags. She ran the coding machine. You know, she had access to everything. So you'll see Heidi on her first case officer assignment when, after 10 years, David Whipple, the guy in the Speedo, actually encourages her. He was a mentor, even though he hated feminism and hated feminists. He mentored Heidi. And so I bet some of you might be able to imagine who the woman in the foreground is. That's Shirley Temple Black, who was a U.S. ambassador. And Heidi was assigned to Geneva, Switzerland, to UN headquarters. She was there as a third secretary. That was her cover job. But her nighttime job was as a CIA case officer. So she said to her boss, David Whipple, she looked around these big conference rooms. She saw all these male diplomats. This was in the 1980s. And she saw all these female clerks and secretaries. And she said to him, you know what? I'm going to target women. I'm going to recruit women. And he said, all right, if you want your career to end before it's even begun, be my guest. And so one of my favorite operations in the book is when Heidi decides to show him up and amounts a very successful recruiting operation of one of the women that she saw in one of those conference rooms who, like women all over the world in the 1980s, was really starting to get pissed off at her own bosses. And what Heidi knew was that, and what all CIA case officers are taught, are the inducements for somebody to spy and to pass information are money, or helping their children or their parents with education or medical treatment, but also revenge. Being pissed off is a classic reason why people pass information to another spy service. And so Heidi took advantage of that in an operation that was very significant. So you can see that women are tilting against these stereotypes, even as they are being held down by the stereotypes. Just a couple of photos, actually. What happened to Lisa Manful was that she was recruited into the clandestine service. This is Lisa in the middle there in her training at the training facility called The Farm. So Lisa, the CIA says, oh, yes, Lisa, we want you so much. We'll be welcomed into our clandestine service. We'll make you a case officer, everything you want. Then when they put her in training, they're like, no, actually what we want you to do is be the Miss Moneypenny of the clandestine service. We want you to sit at a desk, receive the reports that the case officers bring in, and send them back to headquarters. And Lisa's like, no, that's not what you told me when you recruited me for the spy service. And so she pushed back. She was taken out of training, sent back to headquarters. She made the mistake of falling in love with a fellow case officer. She got married. And instead of being able to start her own spy career, she was forced to resign. And when I tell this to like 20-somethings, they're like, what? And yet people who maybe have worked in government, worked at the State Department in the 80s and even into the 90s, remember this. If you wanted to be a Foreign Service officer and you were a woman, you couldn't get married. If you wanted to work in the spy service, you couldn't get married. And if you did, there was a word for you. You became an immobile. You were seen as being unable to travel overseas because what husband would follow a wife overseas? And so Lisa Manful Harper now had to resign and follow her husband to his overseas posting and serve her country unpaid as a wife, doing the same sort of street craft, the same sort of trade craft that he was doing, only she was doing it as an unpaid wife on no career track, no career advancement, no promotion, no pay. But she loved the work. And to me, this is the part of the book that isn't sad, in that she loved the work so much that she was just grateful. I mean, yes, it's sad. It's actually outrageous, but I do want to convey how much these women loved their work and how much they believed in it and how much fun they had doing this work. So that's Lisa. She was ultimately able, after 10 years of working as an unpaid spouse, she was allowed to come back to the farm to train and to become a case officer in her own right. And this is Lisa in disguise class. So she asked me to blur, even though they're already disguised, she asked me to blur the faces of her classmates just in case they were recognizable. So she's there in the middle. She feels like she looks like a prostitute in that photo. I don't know whether she does or not, but she thinks that's very funny. And they enjoyed. Another canard stereotype was that women won't travel. Another favorite character in the book to me was Shirley Sulick. So Shirley Sulick, who died unfortunately 2 years ago or 3 years ago when I was reporting the book, I didn't get to interview her. She was going into treatment for lung cancer, but I was able to interview her husband, Mike Sulick, who was so happy and grateful to be able to talk about how important Shirley Sulick was to his career. And Mike was is a very respected member, retired now of the clandestine service. He ultimately became head of the clandestine service. He served in Moscow for 2 postings. That's one of the hardest postings for the CIA officer. You are surveilled all the time by the KGB. So wives are incredibly important assets, particularly during these postings. They get a lot of the training that the men get at evasive driving. Shirley loved evasive driving. And also at the basic trade craft or street craft, she would carry a big purse. You can see it in that photo. She would let fall like a lipstick or a pencil, and then she would sweep up the message that a KGB asset was leaving for Mike. So I was really happy. Although I was very sorry not to get to talk to her, I was really happy to be able to pay tribute to the decades-long commitment of people like Shirley Sulick, again, unpaid or at most paid as secretaries in the CIA station. Again, a stereotype about women was that they're more emotional and less objective, not sufficiently aggressive. And just quickly, this is a photo of Jean Vertifoy, who was the gimlet-eyed CIA counterintelligence analyst who identified Aldrich Ames, who led a team of women, and you'll meet them as well, who identified Aldrich Ames as the mole, who one of the most devastating traitors in U.S. history, passed to the KGB the identities of CIA assets who were in the KGB, leading to the execution of those agents, the loss not only of their lives, which was devastating, not only for them and their families, but for the CIA people who worked with them. And it was a team of women who knew him and who were friends with his wife, who were cold-eyed and objective enough to ultimately follow the money trail, follow the paper trail, and also observe the outsized renovations that were taking place in their homes, in their home in North Arlington. They looked at the window treatments and they said no government employee can afford to put that many window treatments up at the same time. So again, a really sort of unique viewpoint, but very cold-eyed and committed objectivity. So you might think to yourself, okay, that's all in the past. We've seen Mad Men. We've seen all sorts of series about how women were treated in the advertising industry, in all sorts of industries in medicine. But, what does it matter now? I mean, thank you to Lisa and Heidi and the people who pushed against these stereotypes. But we're past that now. So it's important to remember that at the CIA, there is a very, very equally important group of employees who work mostly at headquarters, who are the analysts, who take this intelligence that's gathered at such great risk, and who read it and read other sources and write reports for the president, because the CIA was created, remember, to avoid another Pearl Harbor, another terrible attack. So In the analytic core, the same sorts of stereotypes often held true about women and their capacities. It was a little bit more welcoming of women, but women tended to get channeled into niche, less important fields of analysis, like in the 1990s, counterterrorism, which was not a sexy place to be for the 80s, for the 70s, for the 80s, and into the 90s, even after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Every analyst wanted to be, on the Soviet desk, or on, at one point on the Cuba desk or the North Korea desk, or these really important anti-communism efforts. Like you were going to get your analysis into the president's daily brief if you were on those desks. And again, this is a government bureaucracy. It's a career service. You want your promotion. So there was a whole group of women who were funneled into counterterrorism, who started paying attention to the attacks that were actually taking place in Europe in the 1980s. If you remember the airplane hijackings and the explosion in the 80s, then into the 1990s, there was a group of women primarily who were paying attention to this shadowy group of fighters who were being funded by this mysterious guy named Osama bin Laden. And so you'll see in this, you'll see President Bush, his cabinet, and you'll see this woman in the middle, Gina Bennett, who was part of that group of women analysts who tried very hard, beginning in Gina's case in 1993. She wrote the first strategic warning about the intentions and capabilities of Al-Qaeda and the intentions and capabilities of the man who was funding them. So it is really enraging to read this viewpoint about from Richard Helms, who was a CIA director before this, that, so these women aren't, satisfied in their careers, but what's going to happen? Like the government's going to fall apart if they're not being used to the maximum. So Gina is an example of the analytic excellence of this group of women, how hard they tried to get their voices heard, to get into the president's daily brief, to warn both within the building for years and years and years, to be heard, to be taken seriously. Everything, if you've read Lean In, if you've read all of the social science that now exists about women in offices and women in meetings, you can be sure that they encountered all of that as they were trying to get their voices heard. And so the result of the years and years, and they finally did get traction in the building, but then it was a matter of getting the Clinton administration and then the Bush administration to really take these warnings seriously about a group of fighters that weren't backed by a state. They weren't like Hamas or Hezbollah. They weren't well known. They weren't clearly backed by a state. They didn't have uniforms. They didn't have military hardware. But this group of women kept warning, yes, they do have the intent and they do have the capabilities. They're capable of simultaneous bombings of the embassies in Kenya and Tanzania in 1998. The evidence was mounting and mounting with the USS Cole, and the women tried and tried to get their voices heard until, of course, the event that many of us, I'm sure, here under the tent remember. I certainly remember where I was on the morning of September 11th and the fall of the Twin Towers. And what I find very moving is the experience of the analysts. So there's a whole chapter in the book on what it was like to be in the CIA building on September 11th, 2001, as these analysts see what's happening, cope with the grief, the frustration of not having been listened to, and also immediately a very small group have to start working to prevent more attacks, and would devote the next decade and beyond into both finding Al-Qaeda, which of course disperses, all of these terrorists disperse again, and then ultimately finding Osama bin Laden. And the team that tracked Osama bin Laden was, in some cases, the women who had been part of this analytic team even before 9/11 would then join the hunt for bin Laden. But they really created this new kind of field at the CIA called targeting that goes back to what was called the vault women, the women who kept the 3x5 cards, the women who had access to and understood and knew how to analyze the data that was in the CIA database. So the analysts hunting bin Laden would go back and back to data that was collected as terrorists were caught, apprehended, hard drives were taken out of caves, and all of the huge, data caches had to be understood and managed. And so the information management skills that were necessary in World War II, it didn't get any easier. And to learn how to manipulate these databases to understand relationships between women was this. Ironically enough, it was this field that women had been sort of channeled into, but they took these skills and they brought it to the successful hunt for bin Laden, and we all know how that concluded. And so I will leave you with that. I don't know if you would consider that an up note, but many people I interviewed pointed out that if women had not fought to gain their place, persisted, developed their skills, and if the CIA had not ultimately recognized that they needed to be at the table and listened to, the hunt for bin Laden would not have succeeded. So, thank you.
So, I'm sorry to cut you off because you need about 3 hours, and we all want to stay.
Yeah.
But there is another speaker coming through,
yeah.
so you have about 5 minutes for questions.
Great. Okay, good. I can talk really quite fast.
Hi, can you tell us what you know of the psychologist's role in the CIA? Like, to what extent, you said that the psychologists came up with this assessment form. Did they have a role in impact on how genders were seen? Also, were they of particular orientations, like psychoanalytic versus behavioral, or just people who do assessments, that kind of
Well, and in World War II, it's funny. You'll see if you read the book. They were such a manpower shortage that they brought in Freudians, anti-Freudians, animal behavior specialists, anybody they could find with some psychological or psychiatric training was part of that panel. And now the CIA's certainly they're much more sophisticated assessment program to assess people who apply for the agencies. Certainly, psychologists are a big part of that process. There's also, being polygraphed and all sorts of psychological profile that goes on still to determine, like, should this person go into the analytic corps? Should they go into the clandestine service? What is the person psychologically best suited for? And of course, every intelligence officer is assessed for, will you be okay with never having your contributions recognized? And will you be okay with being hauled up before Congress and feeling that the public perception of what you're doing is distorted? And so I think I haven't been through it myself, but there's a whole battery of tests now. And whether or not it's psychologists or psychiatrists, I would imagine it would employ both.
Thank you so much for this. I have a question, but can I first ask, are your earrings recording this conversation?
Oh, yeah.
And if so, are they both doing it stereophonically? Because that would be an
it's
advance.
stereo, the bass and the treble. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about your experience with PRB and producing a book about these operations, and what you'd advise somebody else who's an alumnus of your world in producing
the beautiful thing about our democracy is that I am part of the Fourth Estate, and so I did not have to get review. If you're talking about like the pre-publication review process. No, I'm not. I was never a CIA officer. I was at the Washington Post, and I write books, and I'm an outsider. So it's a great question. It's important. When I'm getting started on a project like this, I ask to speak to the public affairs. I tell them who I am. I tell them what I'm working on. I say, if I'm going to interview a retired officer, I hope you won't shut them down. I hope you'll tell them it's okay to talk to me. I'm objective. I'm fair. I don't have a bias, and so they. And I needed them to make certain people available to me, or I wanted them to. There were people still working for the CIA who had been part of the team that caught bin Laden, and I asked for interviews with them, and I was granted interviews with them. And those interviews would take place with a public information officer present in the building. You have to take notes the old-fashioned way. You can't have your recording device. But all the other interviews that I conducted with Lisa Harper or Heidi August or the many, many other, Mike Sulik, were completely on my own, completely by myself with this person. And it was up to them to decide whether or not they wanted to consult public affairs or submit questions to the pre-publication review board. Some did, some didn't. And they knew, I think, what they could tell me and what they couldn't. And so and with some of them, I interviewed them, at least a dozen times, 30 hours of interviews to get comfortable with the process. So, but then the finished product, I do not have to submit it to the pre-pub. But if you've ever worked for the CIA, anything you write, a poem, would have to be submitted to the PRB.
One more question.
Real quick, do you think Stansfield Turner was the worst director? And secondly, can you speak quickly about Cindy? I think she was the map guru that you write about in your book, and your book is great.
Oh, thank you so much. Yes, Cindy Storer, like Gina Bennett, was one of the early people paying attention to this shadowy group of fighters who were communicating with each other. It was just such a new way of gathering intelligence. You weren't having a report handed to you by an asset. You were working with signals intelligence and what they call open sources, foreign transactions. These were people who were talking in safe houses. There was a lawsuit in London over the ownership of a particular safe house that was being used by Al Qaeda. So somebody like Cindy Storer, an analyst back at headquarters, would have to get somebody to get that the reports of that lawsuit for her. This called gray literature. So again, working with this stream of information, tapping the safe house, but also getting court filings. Or what Cindy found was that what she saw, she was getting all these financial transactions, and she had this light bulb moment after studying it for years that, oh my God, this is called Al Qaeda. It's on their letterhead. The CIA still wouldn't let her use it in publications for several years, but it's called Al Qaeda. Their account, they sign oaths to work for this organization. They're accounting for like desk chairs. They have desk chairs. Like, this is a bureaucracy. This is an organization. And Cindy saw that several years before anybody at headquarters was really willing to accept that there was a bureaucratic, hierarchic terrorist organization with a stream of funders, and that it was called Al Qaeda. So Stansfield Turner, I don't know if he was the worst, but I think he was one of the most disliked, right?